Hey everyone, it's me, Adam, the co-host of Rest for the Wicked. You're seeing me again for a couple of reasons. One, a few episodes ago, we talked to an expert about non-sleep deep rest or yoga nidra as a means to supplement folks who are having challenges with sleeping. I am a person who is still challenged with sleeping. In spite of some of the great advice we got from Brenda Lee Rooney in that episode, it's there's more to it than that for me. I'm staying in a hotel right now in Calgary, beautiful downtown Calgary, and I know that no matter what, I will struggle to get a good sleep tonight. The first night in a hotel is always a challenge. But I'm having challenges sleeping at home, getting the right amount, being able to fall asleep, I guess, quickly enough. I don't think I have restful sleeps. In fact, my wearable device will tell you I achieve very little REM sleep. And so, what I need is an expert to tell me about some of the techniques I can engage in to sleep better. I know that Lisa needs the same thing. She and I are both notoriously bad sleepers. We've texted each other late in the, I was going to say evening, early in the morning to talk to each other about some of the challenges we're having or just to distract ourselves from not being able to sleep. So if you're like me and sleep is a bit of a struggle, maybe you experience insomnia or something else, then I'm hoping that the expert we speak to today can give us some great advice. I know she will give us some great advice, in fact. So come with us on this journey today. Rest for the Wicked is produced in Calgary, Alberta, on Treaty 7 territory, the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Goodstoney First Nations, and the home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. We make this acknowledgement as a small gesture of reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples who have lived on these lands for centuries.
I'm so excited to talk about this topic because I'm coming off of a night of no sleep. So I feel like it's so relevant to so many of us. But to introduce and who the amazing person we're speaking to is my friend and colleague, Sheila. And Sheila, I'd love you to introduce yourself because I don't think I will do it justice with your expertise.
Sure. Yes. Thank you. I'm really, really excited to be here. So my name is Sheila Garland. I'm a registered clinical psychologist and I'm a professor of psychology at Memorial University in Newfoundland.
And I guess Lisa and I should introduce ourselves for our viewing audience also. I'm Adam Rosenhart. I am a business owner and entrepreneur, and I sleep occasionally.
And I'm Dr. Lisa Boulanger. I am a researcher and speaker, and I don't sleep well at all. So this is incredibly relevant. And I would love to know more about why Sheila, why did you get into sleep science? Like, what attracted you to this subject?
So that's a good question. So it started in my undergrad, and I was doing research in the area of psychosocial oncology. And so that's basically just, the whole kind of emotional side of cancer. And of course, as you guys can imagine, when you're diagnosed with cancer, that's a big disruption to your life and it can affect people's sleep. And nobody was really paying attention to the sleep that people with cancer were getting or were not getting and how to effectively address that. So I started investigating interventions to improve sleep in cancer survivors. And then it exposed me to this whole other world, like the whole kind of global impact of stress on sleep and how much sleep just is related to every single physical or psychological or lifestyle change. And it got me really, really excited because it was just so relatable and applicable. And as a clinical psychologist, when I'm working to help people, one of the ways you can make such an improvement in somebody's lives is to get them sleeping better. So it's been an area both research wise, I've been very interested in, but also clinically, I see the impact that I can have. And then that just keeps me interested in doing more.
It's so interesting you say that because about 10 years ago, I was writing a paper on sleep and I asked a friend of mine that's an endocrinologist, so an expert on hormones, essentially human hormones. And I said, "What happens to the hormones, your hormones, if you don't sleep?" And she goes, "Oh, I don't know." And I thought that was such an interesting answer that it's simply not investigated. I'm sure it's much more now, but to your point, people weren't paying attention to the impact or the potential benefit of sleep science.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been doing this now for now, I'm going to age myself, probably close to 20 years. And I have seen just this like explosion of interest. I think it started with like Ariana Huffington. She started talking about how much she loved sleep and needed sleep. And then, media started getting into it and it became almost, probably, we can talk about this too, but a detriment. Like, people started, obsessing and really hyper focusing on their sleep and talking about sleep hacks and everything else like that. And, all the explosion in sleep wearables and tracking. And so now I see the pendulum has kind of swung where, there's a lot of attention on sleep. So it's great. We're learning a lot more, but that also might also be causing problems.
Interesting, because this next question is kind of like, I guess, based on the attitude that Ariana Huffington had. Like, we all know sleep is important, but from a rest and respite perspective, maybe give us your most convincing argument that it's something we should invest in right now.
Yeah. So everything else that people want to achieve and accomplish in their life rests on a foundation of sleep. So people, and I think, maybe we might argue about this, Lisa, but it would be like, okay, if people are going to prioritize physical activity, they shouldn't be doing that at the expense of sleep because your physical performance is not going to be as good. It's going to be compromised if you don't have the bedrock of solid sleep in order to maintain and sustain that. Same with people are always talking about, well, you need to make healthier food choices. You're not even going to do that if you don't have restorative sleep because sleep is what regulates your appetite hormones during the night. So sleep is that foundational health behavior without which it compromises everything else we aim to do. When we think about emotional regulation, when we think about cognitive performance, when we think about, physical health, well-being, immunity, all of those things are regulated and optimized by sleep. So it would be like if you want to have success in these areas, you need to get adequate sleep for you. And that might be different. Like for some people, adequate sleep might be 5 hours. For other people, it's going to be 9. But for you, adequate sleep is necessary for optimal health and functioning.
And I love this because it's something I could absolutely agree with you on with my children. Like, I've never had such a keen interest and emphasis and investment on sleep for my kids. I will say I don't do it as well for myself, but like, I know that my kids are not regulated if they are cut short on sleep. Like, my son had hockey training till late last night and he didn't get down to bed until 9:30. And I know that will have an impact after school today. It is so clearly linked. But again, as an adult, I don't do that for myself as much.
No, and I think that, obviously we take shortcuts.
Yeah.
Right. So, we're often prioritizing other people's needs above that of our own. And I think sometimes, short term we can handle that. But then long term, that's when things really start to kind of get dicey. You will notice short term impacts of insufficient sleep or poor quality sleep. Like you might feel sluggish the next day, you might not be functioning kind of top notch, but health impacts are more likely to be noticed in the long term.
So I know that there's issues with getting to sleep, and that's a lot of what the conversation's around, and we'll certainly revisit that. But what should we do for those people, such as myself, that find ourselves awake in the middle of the night, let's say 3 a.m.?
Yeah. So that's really common and quite funny. So I think understanding why we wake up at 3 a.m., we need to know something about, kind of how our sleep works, right? So 3 a.m. usually represents about the midpoint in somebody's night, whether or not they fall asleep at 11 or 12, or, it's usually around the midpoint. And, when we're asleep, we're not in some steady state. Our mind is actually sort of fluctuating and alternating through the various stages of sleep. So we have 4 stages of sleep. Non-REM is in 3 stages, and then we have a REM stage. So we're cycling in and out of these sleep stages throughout the night. And these sleep cycles usually occur in about like 90-minute bursts, right? So you'll have 90 minutes and you'll go down into deep sleep, and then you'll come back up into lighter sleep. And then you'll often have an awakening, usually during these times when you're in a lighter sleep stage. We might not even remember that we have these awakenings because we might just wake up, turn over, and fall back asleep and not remember it. But by about 3 in the morning, a lot of the sleep pressure that we had been building up to push us into deep sleep and keep us in deeper sleep longer, starts to wear off. So our awakening at 3 p.m. or 3 a.m. tends to be the one that maybe, we get up and go to the bathroom, or, we're a little bit more kind of cognitively aware at that time. It can also become habitual, right? Where, we get into this, just habit where our mind, we have a clock in our mind no matter what, which is why, if we have an early flight, we're more likely to, kind of wake up before the alarm, because we're keeping attended to the need to wake up. So this internal clock can develop a habit where we're just kind of waking up without wanting to. And there's ways to actually trick ourselves to get out of that habit. Sometimes I would suggest to people to like set a slight alarm, maybe a half an hour, 45 minutes before your habitual awakening, whether it's even just like, a notification on your watch. Just disrupt that habit. Have you fall asleep, wake up and fall asleep, and then kind of work your way through that habitual awakening. You can do that for kids too. So that's often one of the strategies in kids who have these nocturnal awakenings, is you kind of like, jostle them a bit, like wake them up slightly, but not fully. And then they'll sort of sleep through those habitual awakenings later on.
That's amazing, because this is something that I not struggle with, I guess. Like, I do get up and use the washroom quite often. It's a cat waking me up. But I wonder, like, for the folks who do wake up at 3 a.m. or whatever, what's a great way to fall back asleep if you're awake, you've gone to the washroom, and maybe your mind starts racing? Is there a strategy for that?
Yeah, so I think, this becomes complicated because we also don't want to pathologize waking up, right? Because depending on where you are in your lifespan, these wake ups can be normal, right? So, the days of, adolescence and young adulthood where you're like dead to the world, sleeping out, like no problem, nothing's going to wake you. As we get older, our sleep does become lighter. So it is more normal to wake up maybe 2 times a night. And what the difference is the staying awake and the mind turning on and that sort of stuff. That's the trick. But I also want to make sure that people aren't engaging in things that would make it more likely for them to wake up in the middle of the night. So one of the most important things that promotes a restorative sleep is something called sleep pressure. And so that's just a homeostatic mechanism that kind of builds up in our brain. It's actually controlled by a neuromodulator called adenosine. So that neuromodulator builds up in our bloodstream throughout the day, the longer that we're awake, and then that helps us fall asleep faster and stay in deeper sleep longer. What happens sometimes is that people will either sleep in, right? So they start building sleep pressure later in the day, or they'll go to sleep earlier before they really should be going to sleep and spend more time in bed. So for example, if I am a 7-hour sleeper, you've got 24 hours in a day, you need 17 hours of sleep pressure to build up to make sure that that 7 hours of sleep I need is like consolidated and good quality sleep. I go to bed before that, I might be able to fall asleep, but then I might find myself waking up in the middle of the night because I don't have enough sleep pressure to sustain me throughout the night. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think this is something that isn't talked enough about. Like you hear about so many of the sleep hacks, but actually making sure you have that sleep pressure. And for me, I know for sure, I travel often, I'm across timelines. I struggle with this for sure. Because as soon as I see a bed, I'm like, I'm getting in it. If somebody has to like keep themselves up for a little while to create that sleep pressure, what are some good things to engage in?
Yeah, and so that's actually what I will tell people is if you want to get rid of that time in the middle of the night that you're awake, you need to squeeze it out. You need to make sure that you wake up at a time that will allow you to function, right? That you're not sleeping in to try and compensate for that lack of sleep at night, but that you have enough sleep pressure as you stay awake later to make sure that your sleep drive is really strong and make sure that once you go to bed, boom, you're out and then you'll be in deeper sleep longer. So, you can do all of the things to try and keep yourself awake that people tell you not to do. Right? So, as long as I tell people to have like at least, maybe about an hour or so of a buffer zone before they want to, their designated kind of like bedtime. So if you're planning, okay, I'm going to go to sleep at midnight, which is not a bad thing, that about 11 o'clock, I'm going to start winding it down. Sometimes people start winding down way too early. They're like 9 o'clock, they're in dim light, they're not doing anything on their phone or whatever, right? Maybe that's just too early for you. You end up falling asleep too early and then waking up in the middle of the night and you're wide awake. So, be on your phone, do your hobbies, whatever else you need to do. Like people have freedom. They don't feel like they're forced to try and go to sleep to, meet some sort of standard that they think they're not meeting. It would be, do whatever you want to do. But then at 11 o'clock, shut it down. Do something that's in dim light, sedentary, pleasant, non-stimulating, relaxing. And then that's when you would prepare yourself for maybe kind of transitioning into sleep. But it might not be needed before then.
Tell us maybe a little bit about termination insomnia and how it differs from other sleep struggles.
So are you referring to sort of waking up too early and not being able to get back to sleep?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think, sometimes sleep troubles are divided into like sleep onset insomnia, sleep maintenance insomnia, or sleep offset, or sometimes referred to as like terminal. But people don't like it when it's referred to as that because it sounds like deadly, right? It sounds like you have terminal insomnia. So sometimes this just represents that somebody's circadian rhythm, their sleep phase is misaligned with their circadian rhythm,
Mm.
right? So, if an early
I
bird,
want to define for listeners what a circadian rhythm
Oh,
is.
yeah. Yeah.
okay, yes, yes, yes. So our circadian rhythm is controlled by our brain, right? It is hardwired, it is set in our brain, and it regulates our behavior, our hormones, all of our physical functionings, our alertness, everything else. And so we can do things to manipulate our circadian rhythm, right? So we can expose ourselves to light at different times. We can take exogenous melatonin. We can do physical activity at different times. We can eat at different times. But if we are in a cave or if we're in a tent and we, let our body just do what it normally would, we're going to fall into what would normally be our circadian rhythm. And so within this rhythm, you have people who are more normally night owls, right? So these are the people who don't get tired. They're just not sleepy, before let's say like 3 a.m. And they would be happiest if they were, able to follow their circadian rhythm, fall asleep 3, 4 a.m. and get up 11, 12 a.m. in the morning. But then there's the opposites where you've got the early birds. And then those are people who, past 8 p.m., they're done, right? There's nothing good coming out of them. And then they might be waking up at 4 in the morning. So, and then the people who fall in the middle of that, those are just like the neutral, kind of people. They're not shifting, really either way. And so for the people who find themselves waking up earlier than they want to, it could be a circadian phase issue that, if that's the time that their body is just saying that they want to get up, that's not a problem if the person accepts that that is, what their body wants to do. And for a certain proportion of the cases that is true. For people who tend to wake up earlier, who don't have this circadian phase preference for earlier awakenings, sometimes it can be comorbid or co-occur with depression. So people will wake up earlier than they want to. They'll start thinking about their day, about, the doom and gloom that, they might anticipate is they're going to face that day. So with those people, it can be really tricky because, again, they don't have the sleep pressure to necessarily go back to sleep at that time. So that can be tricky to address clinically.
So recently I got a CPAP machine, Sheila, because I wasn't breathing when I was sleeping. And like my wife has told me, I've been using it for about a month or two now. And my wife has said, the color in your face is different. And I thought it was so interesting because it never occurred to me. I mean, she knew that I'd stop breathing sometimes while I was sleeping, but it just never occurred to me that like something else was affecting the quality of my sleep. I just thought I just wasn't good at sleeping. And so you're talking about like the comorbidity of depression or other things. Are there a lot of people who just don't realize that these other conditions may be impacting their sleep, and how do we get them to start to think about that, I guess?
Oh, 100%. And let me ask you, has the CPAP machine changed your life? Like, how do you feel?
Yeah, like, okay, so now I'm just getting used to wearing a mask while I'm sleeping, but like I'm sleeping better than I have in probably 15 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing when people who have untreated sleep apnea actually start sleeping better. They're like, it is night and day. So yeah, I think for you with the beard and everything else, the mask fitting might be a bit of a challenge, right? And some people, they struggle a bit with claustrophobia, but there's ways to be able to address that. Sleep apnea is one of those things that people just don't talk about at all, but it is so, so important because what happens when somebody has sleep apnea is when you go into deeper sleep stages, your muscle tone also relaxes. So for somebody with sleep apnea, if the tissue around the airway is relaxing, it's more likely to cause a complete or partial blockage of the airway.
Mm-hmm.
So then your brain is actually bringing you out of deeper sleep each time your body tries to go there. So for people with sleep apnea, they're not getting deep sleep and they're not getting REM sleep.
This might be silly. I like Lisa and I, we talk about sleep a lot, but like I dreamt for the first time last night. I couldn't remember my last dream. So it was like, I'm the kind of person who, when someone like tells me about their dream, I'm like, oh, this is so boring. But I texted a friend of mine who was in my dream and I was like, you'll never believe this. And it didn't occur to me until like 15 minutes later. I was like, oh my gosh, that's the first dream I can remember in years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you weren't getting REM sleep, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when people go on CPAP, oftentimes if they're in a sleep center where they're actually being monitored overnight, they'll do what's called a split night test, where the first half of the night they'll just monitor you naturally, no mask, and then the second half of the night they'll put the mask on. And what they see happens is your brain actually goes into what's called REM rebound. So it'll go into REM sleep and it'll stay in REM sleep really, really long. And that's not typical because, as I explained, you cycle through these sleep stages. So people with sleep apnea, because they're not getting the deep restorative sleep, they're not getting the physical restoration. And with REM sleep, that's more for like memory, emotional regulation. So if they were having mood symptoms before, really kind of maybe down, low, some of that seems to, go away and definitely improve. So yeah, it can be night and day for people with sleep apnea.
It definitely has been.
I will attest that Adam is a different color and definitely more energy in the last little while. And as you mentioned, we talk about sleep a lot. In saying that, like, are there any myths around that you hear often about sleep that are simply untrue?
Oh, so many.
Like
So
what?
many, so many. And the medical professionals, they perpetuate a lot of these myths as well. So, maybe the most obvious one is that, 8 hours is somehow the perfect amount of sleep for you. And if you're not getting that, then somehow it's wrong, or you're not getting enough, or there's going to be health impacts. So, that's not true. We don't know what we have no good way of saying what is a good amount of sleep for somebody. It's basically, this is the amount of sleep you need in order to function and feel rested throughout the day. And as I said, that can range anywhere from 6 hours until 9 hours. And even when we do like large epidemiological studies, you'll actually see, within that's kind of like the protective area. Anything less than that, you see health impacts starting to come up, and anything more than that, you see health impacts. So it's like this is the optimal range, and then at the ends, that's when problems start happening. So that'll be the first one, is that 8 hours is somehow the best. I hear another one, which is funny, that you have to get sleep before midnight, then and that is somehow like the optimal sleep. And that if you fall asleep past midnight, then somehow your sleep is not going to be as good. And that has absolutely no evidence behind it. I think, one of the sleep myths right now, I think, is, that your watch is a good assessment of your sleep. And that in large part is not the case, especially for people who are not great sleepers. So the watches, the sleep trackers, they don't do a terrible job at people who say that they're good sleepers, right? So if you were to compare them to like gold standard polysomnography, they do a relatively okay job assessing your sleep. But in people who are not good sleepers, and those are the people who want to be monitoring their sleep, they're terrible. They're really not very good at adequately measuring sleep, and they cause more harm than they do good, because people will come in for treatment being like, my watch told me I wake up 56 times a night or something like that. And it's like, no, it's trying to infer sleep based on the presence or absence of movement. So even if you're moving around, right, it's going to mistake that for being awake.
Tell me a little bit about the sleep environment and how much that matters. And then connected to that question, well, you know what? I'll let you answer that question, Sheila. And then I have a question relating to this is going to sound a little sexy, but what the bedroom should be used for. So, first question, how much does the sleep environment, like temperature, noise, and light, really matter for our sleep?
Yeah. So I think the sleep environment matters somewhat, but not as much as people think it does, right? I think the sleep internal environment matters way more than the external environment. And what I mean by the sleep internal environment is the two process model of sleep really looks at sleep drive, which is what we talked about before, and also circadian rhythm, right? So, you have to have enough sleep pressure to be able to sleep. And then that time needs to be appropriate to your circadian rhythm. So it needs to be appropriately timed, and you need to have appropriate sleep drive. Now, with those things, sometimes, like for most people, it doesn't matter at all what your sleep environment looks, or what your sleep environment is. Like you could sleep on rocks, right? If you've got enough like sleep drive and it's appropriately timed. So for people who might be, temperamentally, a little more challenging to soothe or relax, that's where the external sleep environment does come into play. Now, I think mattress companies and pillow companies and everything else, they're going to try and convince you that, they're going to have the answer to the sleep problems. Most of the time, it's not. Generally, you need to have a dark environment. Just because of circadian rhythm issues. And you also want to have a cool environment, right? Because we want our body temperature to drop. That helps with sleep onset. So you want a cool environment, and you want a quiet environment. You want to kind of like block out that stimuli. So dark, cool, and quiet are the most important aspects of a sleep environment.
I'm somebody that really appreciates white noise,
Yes.
right? So like, is that too loud? Is that something that's disruptive, or am I normal?
100%, right? So that helps because it buffers, right? Because your
Right.
mind, your brain, is paying attention to differences in sound when you're sleeping. So, this relates to people who say, "Oh, I need the TV to fall asleep," right? I can't fall asleep without the TV. And I will try and wean them off of the TV in order to get them onto like a white noise or something like that. Because, in the time of commercials, commercials are always louder than the actual
Yeah.
show, right? So you would have the brain recognizing that these commercials were louder, or the differences in the sound, and it would cause these arousals. Whereas the white noise, it kind of buffers all of that. So if you are sensitive to somebody, shutting the car outside your house or something like that, it's going to reduce the impact of those. I know even my daughter, I've raised her with a noise machine, and when it's off, it's weird, right? She's
Hmm.
that's
Yep.
that's unusual. So yeah, no, white noise machines great for babies, and also good for grown-ups.
All right. So my question then related to this sort of sleep environment is, I don't know if this is like, I don't know if I should use the word wisdom, but this idea that you should use your bedroom only for like sleep and sex, basically. Is that true? Or like, because for example, my wife, like when she gets home, she loves laying prone on the bed and reading or watching a show. Does that mess with her sleep at all? Just being in that environment and position?
So, in general, yes, exactly what you said. The bed should be reserved for sleep and sex only. And this has to do with classical conditioning principles, right? So, if you pair a stimulus with a whole bunch of other responses, that stimulus becomes a weak cue for those things. So if you're working, if you're eating, if you're watching TV, if you're playing on your phone, if you're talking, like if you're pairing all of those different things with your bed, when you go to bed, it's kind of like I could be doing any of these things, right? But if you only repeatedly pair your bed with sleep, night after night after night after night after night, the bed becomes a really strong conditioned stimulus to produce sleep as a response, right? And we are creatures that, develop these conditioned associations very easily, very, almost unconsciously. It's the same reason if we repeatedly pair our couch and watching TV with snacking. Even if we're not hungry, if we go and sit in the chair that we usually watch TV and snack in, all of a sudden we're going to be like, I have to do something with my hands. I should be eating right now, right? That is why the rule is to repeatedly only pair your bed with sleep. We throw sex in there, not because we necessarily want that to be the cue, but because we want to say, this is also an acceptable behavior in that environment.
On that note, and with that like idea of conditioning, is that why bedtime routines seem to be so fundamental to sleep?
Oh, 100%. And this is why people do them with kids, right? So, you wouldn't expect that you could take your kid off the playground, throw them into bed, and they would be able to sleep, right? Of course, they need that kind of time to transition from being awake. And it's sort of like a gradual process from, being upright, being in bright light. You kind of work your way into dimmer light as you go, and more sedentary, slow, calm, relaxing activities prior to bed. And yet somehow we forget that when we're applying those principles to ourselves, and we're like, oh yeah, 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 I've got to like do this email. Oh right, I've got to like load the dishwasher or fold the laundry or do whatever. And I also have to sleep. So yeah, we forget those principles with ourselves. But we do employ them for our kids. And, I don't know why we don't give ourselves the same space to do that.
What is the ideal bedtime routine? And why I ask this question is so specific to, I work with organizations around the world, such different populations, and I've realized we have one thing in common. We have a couple things like paying taxes, but everybody scrolls through their phone before bed. It's almost like this soothing behavior that adults have created. I know generally this is less than ideal, but I would love to hear from you on your thoughts of specifically scrolling, but what that bedtime routine could be. What could we replace it with?
Yeah. So for the longest time, it was told to people that you should avoid devices because of the light. And it's not the case, right? So there's been some really compelling studies that have been done that have debunked the idea that it's the light that's emitted from the phone which causes the difficulty sleeping. It's not the light, it's the engagement.
Hmm.
And so that is if it is that the engagement and the cognitive arousal that it produces. So I guess it depends what you're doing. If you are scrolling on social media, then you're kind of looking for something. It's not just passive, right? You're like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. So it's like, a little bit of like a dopamine hit each time you find something that you're looking for. So, if you are, going through your emails, then, it could be like, oh crap, I got to do that the next day. Or, I really don't like that person and I don't like the tone of their email. Or, if you're reading the news, then, you're getting on like, new like current events and, maybe that's distressing. So we generally in the hour before bed want to do things that are pleasant, non-stimulating, sedentary, putting your device down for the most part, unless you're doing something on it. Like a lot of people will read ebooks, right? And so if that's what they're doing and it's just a process of I'm just reading, if people are doing something kind of passive and relaxing, like they're doing Sudoku or, something like that, as long as it's not something, like Candy Crush that you're like trying to get engaged in and you can't put down or, so it really depends, but it's not something that is sort of like you just can't use devices, but it's how are you using those devices? And really, if you are in bed, you should be in bed trying to sleep. Or not trying, but just, in the process of sleeping. So by the time you get to bed, devices should be done. If you're doing that outside of your bed and you're doing it like maybe you're listening to a podcast or you're listening to an audiobook or whatever, there's ways to use devices that don't disrupt your sleep, but definitely not scrolling.
Dang. I guess that changes that habit for me. I wonder, you mentioned earlier, we talked about you briefly, melatonin. What about like magnesiums, herbal teas? What actually works to help get us to sleep and what's overhyped?
All of those things are overhyped. And there's no evidence that they actually work for insomnia.
Wow.
Or if there are studies, they don't work any better than placebo. And placebo is a real effect, right? So, if you think something is going to work, it's going to work at least temporarily until the one night it doesn't. And then it bursts the placebo bubble and it doesn't work anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So melatonin is only indicated for the treatment of shift work disorder, circadian rhythm sleep disorders, and jet lag. So those are the only conditions in which it actually has empirical evidence for efficacy. So when people experience insomnia as a disorder is described as difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, or waking up too early, that is not necessarily fixed by melatonin because it's not caused by a disruption in melatonin. A lot of time it's caused by behaviors, and it's also caused by arousal, right? So like I'm just, anxious or, there's other emotions that are getting in the way of me being able to sleep. So when I recommend magnesium, I do so for usually either periodic limb movements, so like leg twitches, leg cramps, those sorts of uncomfortable physical things in the feet, legs, or calves that can get in the way. And so magnesium can have some benefit for treating those like leg cramps. But then I recommend it needs to be taken with calcium because calcium helps the magnesium be absorbed. So that's the evidence for magnesium is if there's something getting in the way of your ability to sleep. Chamomile tea, it helps because tea is relaxing and probably you're sitting down, it's peaceful, right? Pleasant. You're having some like, nice comforting tea, right? Warm milk, right? So it's not necessarily what you're consuming. It's like the environment in which you're consuming it is having more of an impact than, the actual supplement or whatever you're having.
That's the thing, right? It's the habit. It's something I do on the road. Because it's almost available in every hotel room. So it's become like a tradition of mine to have some tea, like chamomile tea is usually what they have access to. So certainly something I do, but I never thought of, yeah, just the habit formation of it. How does sleep or the lack thereof or the benefit from spill over to mental health, mood, and work performance? I think so many of us, especially at a certain age, like younger ages, like, but how can it help us perform?
Yeah, so that gets to one of the main functions of sleep, right? So when we think about, and I mentioned this a little bit before, but certain stages of sleep are responsible for more of emotional regulation, cognitive performance. So, that is what sleep does, right? Sort of like, sleep helps us form memories. Sleep helps us learn, right? The days of people trying to pull all-nighters and then trying to, get a good mark on an exam, right? We know now that, you need to actually sleep so you can form those memories long-term in your brain. Or, the reason why we're a little bit more moody or emotional when we haven't had a good sleep is because our brain didn't get the chance to really help us process those emotions, right? And I think people will relate to the fact that sometimes, we wake up and, we've had, an emotional dream and we're mad at somebody in our dream because of something that they did in our dream, and the person didn't do that, right? But we know that like dreams help us process. That's the foundation. We know that sleep disturbance is a consequence, or it's something that co-occurs with virtually every other psychological and physical disorder. So it's a key symptom of depression and anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. It also is disrupted in so many disorders that have to do with, painful conditions, cancer. It's key there. And I think traditionally people used to think that if you treated the condition, right? If you treated the depression and you treated the PTSD or you fixed the pain, that the sleep would get better. And we know now that once the sleep problem has sort of gotten stuck, right? It's become chronic. It gets a life of its own. So it's no longer thought that you can just treat the depression and the insomnia or the sleep disorder goes away. You actually have to treat both, because if the insomnia is still there, it's the biggest predictor of having a depressive relapse or, from not being able to manage your pain or something like that. So I think now the medical community is starting to recognize the importance of taking sleep seriously and not just seeing it as like a secondary thing.
Now, if someone came to you and this would never happen, but they're like, I want to change one habit tonight to sleep better, not knowing a ton about the person, Sheila, what would you recommend they do?
And I just want to point out, you say that would never happen. I'm so keenly
I
listening
guess
to
so.
this response. Like,
Yeah.
Get up at the same time every day, no matter how much you slept.
Okay. Wow. But I want to sleep in.
That's my answer, right? Because your wake up time is what sets your sleep homeostat, right? So if you want to sleep better at night, you need to keep your wake up time consistent, because that's what's going to make your sleep more regular. And
and
so you need to start there with the wake up.
can I ask a very selfish question about exactly that?
Yeah.
If I'm crossing time zones,
You're
how
complicated, Lisa.
I mean, generally true, but like if I'm crossing time zones and I try to take that awake time seriously, how close is close enough? Like, can I be within an hour and it's about the same effect, or does it have to be pretty spot on?
Yeah, so time zones are tricky. And so generally it's going to take your body 1 day for every hour of time difference to adjust. So I think it depends how big of a difference you are thinking about. So 1 hour might not seem like very much until you consider how much disruption daylight savings time
Right.
does to people,
Mm.
right? Which is just 1 hour, and people freak out. But there's also, really strong evidence that it's like linked to increased car accidents and heart attacks and, a whole bunch of health concerns too, just that change in the 1 hour. So, crossing time zones, is tricky. So 1 hour is, not terrible. But, yeah, I think that's a bit of like a complicated thing because it depends how long you're there and then how you kind
Yes.
of come back. Like there's a lot to manage in people who travel time zones for a long time. And there's a whole massive like science around optimizing that. And they've done it really well for athletes, right? Sort of like optimizing their sleep if they're traveling, back and forth for games and whatnot. They've got specialists that are just doing that as their full-time thing.
I'm going to look into that. Now, my next question, I want to fully be transparent. This is Adam's question. Not that it's not a question, but I'm going to ask it. Can you die from lack of sleep, or would you just fall asleep?
So the answer to your question is no, you can't die from lack of sleep. But I will say there's like really interesting genetic condition, which was called fatal familial insomnia. So this is recorded in medical records, and it was like basically a family of people that they developed this insomnia, and eventually they died. That's obviously something that doesn't happen to most people. So what happens is people will have bad sleep, bad sleep, bad sleep, and then they'll usually have like a night of like good sleep, and they'll be like, oh, and then but they'll get into this pattern of like bad sleep, good sleep, bad sleep, good sleep, right? But that is actually evidence of this sleep homeostat in action, right? But it's usually the arousal that gets in the way because, somebody's like, am I going to sleep tonight? I'm not going to sleep tonight. And they get themselves really, really worked up about what's going to happen if I don't sleep, that actually prevents them from sleeping or makes it much harder for them to sleep. And it's not until their sleep homeostat gets so strong that overcomes that arousal that they actually have a night of sleep. But then it just keeps going because they're like, oh, finally, I got a good night's sleep. I really want a good night's sleep again. And then that pressure just keeps the cycle going.
So, like, is the advice then to be a little bit more nonchalant about it and just being like, well, I'm comfy and I'm relaxed and that's good enough for tonight, right? Like, how do you then prevent that, I guess?
Yeah. So the nonchalant is great, right? So the more we get anxious and the more we try and control our sleep, the more it pushes back. But I would say as long as you're not being like, oh, I'm nonchalant, restless, or just resting in bed, right? We want to keep that like, bed is for sleeping and sex only. So if you're not
Right.
sleeping, go be nonchalant and rest, somewhere else.
This is great advice, but I swear to God, if I open my bedroom door, my son wakes up. My 9-year-old wakes up. Like there's something about my door that is the loudest noise. It's not loud at all, but it's the loudest noise to him. So I'm like so limited on where I could go without disrupting other people's sleep
Yeah. Yes.
that I'm in a really bad. So I should just at least get out into a chair. Like I should just do something to get out of bed.
Or even sit up, right? Because so when I work with people with mobility challenges, maybe they're at high risk of falling or whatnot, we don't ask them to get out of bed at night, right? So, but when you sit up, you're no longer trying. You're like, okay, I'm just gonna, be here. I'm gonna do something, but you're not wanting to say, I'm gonna start working. Right.
Right.
So you're wanting to pay attention to the conditioned association and what are you doing? How are you reinforcing that behavior again? So, but if you're doing something that would be consistent with the things you would be doing in your buffer zone. So doing something pleasant, non-stimulating, relaxing, sedentary, and dim light, right? So that might mean you're reading a book, right? But your dim light, you're not going to sit there and try and sleep. The more we try and sleep, the more it backfires. Like one of my clients, I remember, handed me one of those like finger traps, the things that you stick your fingers in, and the more you really try and pull them, the more the trap kind of like sticks your fingers in there. He was like, this is what I learned from you. Here's my like, my gift. And I thought that was a great analogy because it really is. The more, you can only get your fingers out by just like, not really trying. all that much to get them out.
Do you know how hard this is as a AAA personality to be like, try less, right? But it's exactly that. It's letting go and trying less.
You know how a lot of people pay attention to like, trust your body for hunger cues, right? Or like trust your body in all these other ways. Trusting your body knows how to sleep, right? We don't need to do anything to sleep. This is something biological, and we try and control our sleep. But imagine if you were like, I'm going to try and control my digestion, right? How much anxiety that like you'd end up with ulcers if you're like, I need to digest my food more, or I'm going to control my breathing and end up passing out, or like those are all just biological things that our body does naturally, and so is sleep. But we get in there and we muck it all up.
Sheila, this has been such an enlightening conversation. I think for me, like there's actionable things from our chat that I feel like I can bring into the bedroom tonight, not to sound too salacious, but I wonder, just as a last question, to give you the opportunity to maybe share with us, to you, what is one of the most exciting new discoveries in sleep science right now?
Yeah. So let me think about that for a second. This isn't necessarily like, hot off the presses, but it's recent enough when you think about how long science takes. So, probably in the last decade, we have discovered more about the importance of sleep for the prevention of neurodegenerative conditions like dementia and Alzheimer's. So, in work done initially on animals, they were able to demonstrate that when we sleep, our brain actually shrinks a little bit, and it allows more space for the lymphatic system to sort of like wash away byproducts or like toxins from our brain, like beta amyloid and tau. And those are the things that, are kind of byproducts of, thinking and, operations of the brain. So it flushes those away. So it actually, I think about it like, our brain gets a bath. Like, when we're sleeping, there's people in there scrubbing things around and just basically cleaning it all up and preventing the buildup of these toxins that, can contribute to the development of these neurodegenerative conditions. So I think that's really exciting is, just even the value, our optimal sleep health throughout the lifespan. So yeah, that was fascinating. And I haven't heard of anything since I heard about that got me as excited as that did.
Well, you've come up with a new term for sleeping that I'm going to use, which is brainwashing. So an old term for a new thing. Sheila, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun.
No, thank you. I am absolutely for the next couple of weeks going to try waking up at the same time and trying to sort it out a little bit with diving into the jet lag time zone science that you talked about and getting more sleep pressure. Because I think that's part of my issue is I get so tired that I end up going to bed too early. So I'm going to come up with some creative ways to work on that and see what happens.
People always are afraid. They're like, oh, there's this window. If I miss this window, I'm going to like have like a second wind and then I'm not going to be able to fall asleep. Yeah, no, like I'll have people, if they feel like, I just can't stay awake, I'll have them sit on a hardback chair or lean on the wall or something like that, because the most important thing is that sleep pressure. Like when they go to bed, I want them actually like head bobbing, like, so tired that when their head hits the pillow, boom, they're out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, lots for us to think about. And thank you again for joining us today. This was great.
Thank you so much, Sheila.
No problem. Thank you.
Rest for the Wicked was filmed on location in Calgary, Alberta by Philip Harrison and Centerpin Media. Pre- and post-production by Conscious Works and Adverb Communications. And of course,
you can connect with us through the Rest for the Wicked Instagram and TikTok accounts at Rest for the Wicked Pod. And make sure you subscribe to Rest for the Wicked wherever pods are cast.
I've never heard anyone say that before, so I wanted to...
I like it.
We'd love to hear about your experiences and struggles with different forms of rest. And if you have an idea for a future episode, let us know that too.
In the meantime, remember, get some rest so you can stay wicked.